Recording. Okay. Well, hi, my name is Frank Harris, and I'm the Director of State Government Affairs for Mothers Against Drunk Driving. And as we continue Crime Victim Rights Week here, uh, today we have a very special guest from Marsys Law for the United States, or for us, or for all, Marsys Law for all, which have really been on the forefront with MADD in battling for victim rights, specifically with passing a constitutional amendment in every state to ensure victim rights. And today we have Jeff Kaye with Marsys Law, and we're just going to discuss some of their efforts as they've really carried a lot of water in advocating for every victim's rights throughout our country on a state-by-state basis. So Jeff, thanks again for joining.
Absolutely.
And just real briefly for viewers here, what is Marsys Law for All? And this secondary to that, what is the story of Marsy, which sparked the call for this law?
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. Appreciate it. We've had the opportunity to work with a lot of different MADD organizations in some of our various states who help us out in our efforts. And so we appreciate that. You're joining me from my home office / guest room, as it were, because of the scenario that we're all going through right now. But I'm happy to be here. Marsys Law as an organization, I'll talk about what we do as an organization real quick first, and then tell you about Marsy herself and her story and what inspired Marsys Law. As an organization, we're a national organization that focuses on enforceable constitutional rights for crime victims. These rights are rights like the right to be present at trial and through critical stages, the right to be heard, the right to be notified, and the standing to assert your rights in court. Those are, some of the rights. There's also the right to be free from intimidation and harassment and a host of others, but those are some of the core rights that we're talking about when we're talking about what are constitutional rights. And right now, we are pushing in a bunch of states to get state constitutional rights. Our eventual goal would be to add an amendment to the US Constitution where crime victims do have their own constitutional rights. But we understand that obviously that's a very lofty goal, and that takes time. And so in the meantime, we can implement these rights on a state level and make sure that a lot of crime victims are covered. In the last 12 years, we've passed Marsys Law on the ballot in something like 14 states, and have had, tremendous success and are continuing down that path. So that's what we do. Who we are in our story, if you're a victims' rights organization and you're named after a young woman, there's a sad story. That is the case with Marsys Law. It's the case with a lot of organizations, in this field. And, Marsy was a young woman who was murdered on November 30th, 1983 in Santa Barbara. She was a college student at UC Santa Barbara at the time. She was stalked and killed by her ex-boyfriend. And at the time, as all victims do, her family, victims in this case, struggled. They struggled mightily with going through this and being thrust into a system that they knew nothing about. They'd never been in the criminal justice system before. And then they found themselves re-victimized in a pretty serious and impactful way by the system itself. Actually, on the way home from Marcy's funeral, they stopped by the grocery store down the street from their house, and they ran into the killer at the grocery store. There was, the killer had been released. There was a bail hearing. They weren't notified that there was a hearing, let alone that the result of that hearing was release. And because they didn't have the right to that notification at the time in California. This was in 1983. Now, the victim does have a lot of those rights, but at the time they didn't have that. And then that killer proceeded to, taunt and harass them while he was out on bail. Now, he ended up getting convicted and spent the rest of his life behind bars, but as you can imagine, that was just so traumatizing for that family. And they were like any other American family, middle income family, struggling through uncharted territory for themselves. And so it was brutal. And at the time, there was nothing that they could do about it. But as time went on, and their lives had to go on without their sister and daughter, Dr. Nicholas he's the chairman of our organization. He is Marsy's brother. And he had found great success in business, did very, very well for himself. And after he was able to retire years later, decided to spend a lot of his time and effort and energy and means into making sure other people didn't go through what he went through. And so and he talked to a lot of different national organizations. I'm sure MADD was in the mix. I'm sure, the National Crime Victims Law Institute, a host of others, organizations. And he said, what can we do to make sure nobody gets re-victimized by the system itself? Nothing can take away the loss that we go through as a victim, but what can we do? And one of the things that they kept coming to is in places where victims had enforceable, strong constitutional rights, victims are less likely to feel victimized by the process. And so he started working with some experts and started building this organization. And I've been lucky enough to be a part of this organization for a number of years now. And that's the basis of where we come from, and what inspired Marsys Law as an organization to get started.
Yeah, and you mentioned the success you all have had in ensuring Marsys Law and as a constitutional amendment in state constitutions. How many states now have Marsys Law or in this ensured that victims have a constitutional right?
Yeah. So 11 states have Marsys Law, which is in effect right now today. Mm-hmm. And those are, some of the strongest enforceable rights that you could find. Those are states like California, Nevada. I'm looking at my notes just so I don't leave anyone important out. California, Nevada, Illinois, Ohio, Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Oklahoma, North Dakota, South Dakota. These are some of the states that have Marsys Law. But as you kind of alluded to, victims' rights as a concept that exists outside of Marsys Law, and we stand on the shoulders of giants in the victim rights space who have really advocated for victims' rights for upward of 30 years now. So there are states like Arizona and Texas and Oregon, states that have been doing this for a long time that have enforceable victims' rights. It's not Marsys Law, but we wouldn't feel the need to go back in and revisit their state constitutions. Whereas in some states, my home state being Nevada, I'm here in Reno, Nevada right now, we felt the need, we had an amendment, but it wasn't enforceable. So we came back in and retooled that amendment and passed on the 2018 ballot so that now it's a much stronger amendment. So in total, 35 states have some form of victims' rights in their constitution. There are 15 states with no victims' rights in their constitution, and we endeavor to make that list smaller and smaller.
Yeah, and 35 states, they have some form of it, but the question comes to, are victim rights actually being served in all 35 of those? And it sounds like, even now, and I know like in my home state, Wisconsin, there was a cleanup to the Victims' Rights Amendment, constitutional amendment that Marsys Law is pushing. So, just because there is an amendment in the books doesn't mean it's necessarily the serving all victims. And I'm just wondering, Wisconsin, you mentioned Nevada, where you got to go back to make sure that these are enforceable. Any experiences with that, because that's just part of the ballot. It's just like passing any type of law or constitutional amendment. You got to make sure it's enforceable. So I guess the question I have is just, these 35 states that have some version of a constitutional victim rights amendment. Do you see any areas where where there's going to be a push to improve current laws? And then the 15 states that do not have Marsys Law or a constitutional victim rights amendment, which states do you think might enact something in the near future?
Absolutely. So the answer to your first question is, there are some states that still have a victims' rights amendment, but it's not necessarily enforceable. And it's not that those states did anything wrong at the time when they passed their victims' rights amendment. They waded into a new space, which victims' rights, was relatively new. Constitutional victims' rights was relatively new about 30 years ago. And they waded in a little more carefully than maybe some others who really jumped in. And so some of the states that have constitutional rights but could use a retool, Wisconsin was one of those. In fact, for those of you who don't know, I'm sure you do because it's your home state, but Wisconsin, we just passed on their April 7th ballot with 75% of the vote, and that was a people's vote. And I should mention, for some folks who are following this who maybe don't understand or know the process in and out, in order to amend a state constitution, in I think 49 states, I want to say Vermont or Connecticut, I should know this, Vermont or Connecticut is the example where they don't need to go to a vote of the people. But in most places, you have to go through either a signature gathering phase and then go to the ballot so that the people of your state vote on it, or through the legislature, where the legislature refers it to the ballot and then the people vote on it. Because a constitutional amendment is the people's document. It articulates the principles by which that state, find value, and that's another one of the reasons why we think victims' rights belongs in the Constitution. So in Wisconsin, we recently passed it with 75% of the vote. There are other states that have it. We're currently active in Mississippi and Tennessee. Those are two states that both have some form of victims' rights, but could use a revisit. And so we're going through those legislatures. We're going through the legislatures right now, even during these uncertain COVID-19 times. And we're going through those and feel good about those states. So there's a couple states out there that we would still, take a look at, maybe Indiana, a few others. I'd have to get into a whole spreadsheet if I was going to tell you each one, but there's a handful that we're definitely looking at. And then for the states with no constitutional rights, I'm going to quickly read off the list for you, just so the people out here know which
That'd be helpful.
have no constitutional rights. And this is in no particular order. They're just as I sort of saw them on my map. But you've got Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, New York, West Virginia, Delaware, Arkansas, Iowa, Minnesota, Wyoming, Hawaii, Montana, Kentucky, and Pennsylvania. Now, some of those states we've actually passed in, but are in some stage of a lawsuit, which happens at times when you're passing constitutional amendments. The ACLU is an organization that has opposed us in a couple of states, and we have to work through that. So in Pennsylvania and Kentucky, for instance, we passed on the ballot in both of those states, but are in various lawsuits where we're getting through that so that they can actually go into effect. Pennsylvania will go into effect, once we clear this hurdle with the lawsuits soon. And then Kentucky, actually, we went through a lawsuit and were thrown out. We went straight back to the state legislature. The state legislature passed it again, and now we're going to be back on the ballot with the full amendment text, because there was a question about whether we needed to put the full text on. So we're going straight back. In states where we face hurdles, we don't just pick up and leave. We are committed to the cause and continue this fight. And so some other states that we're operating in that have no victims' rights, I should say, there's Maine, New Hampshire, Iowa. We have a presence in all of those states and in some of those states also. And so we're in various phases of the campaign. We're still working to make sure that list gets smaller and smaller.
Well, yeah, and just what you just described, it just shows the mountain that victim rights groups like MADD and like Marsys Law for All has to go through. And getting a constitutional ballot initiative that is very difficult, much more difficult than passing legislation. And it just kind of speaks to how difficult it is to ensure victim rights. And we all know that those who are accused, they have constitutional rights, but as the Marsys Law, as their organization have seen from the founding, is that it's much more difficult to ensure victim rights. And that's why it's so important to push for these constitutional amendments to ensure victim rights. And that's why, MADD, we're a victim rights group as well. And we push for that. We have victim advocates who who serve impaired driving victims, help navigate them through this very difficult court system process for civilly and criminally. And I guess just with that, what can MADD and other victim rights groups do here on out to ensure more constitutional victim rights amendments, specifically Marsys Law,
Yeah.
is enacted in every state? Because this is a big deal to ensure victim rights.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. We face probably a similar hurdle that MADD faces, I would imagine, in that when you have these conversations with folks out in the public, with your friends, with family, with people, everyone goes, yeah, that makes sense. It's common sense. Why don't we just jump right on that? But I think we know that, when you enter legislative buildings and when you're looking for change on a larger scale through legislation, which MADD pursues in all of the states that you guys are active in, and constitutional amendments, which we pursue, that you run into a larger intellectual conversation about the weights of certain people's rights versus others and that kind of thing. And as an organization, I'll speak for my organization. I think it may apply to yours, but we're not trying to take anyone's rights away. We're just about treating people with the dignity and respect that they deserve. We're about giving the victims the rights that they deserve. And that doesn't mean anyone else. This isn't a zero-sum rights game where I have rights and then suddenly you lose rights if I get some. We don't view it that way. And frankly, neither do the constitutional scholars that we talk to. So, we are thrilled and we feel a real benefit by working with organizations like MADD and other organizations in the victim rights space who have been doing this for a long time, who are connected in their communities, who frankly have survivor and victim stories to tell. And I think that's the thing. If you're asking what can someone do to help Marsys Law, or probably help MADD also, if you are a survivor or a survivor, and the truth is everyone does know a survivor, but connect with one another, connect with we've got a great online presence. I know you guys do as well. Connect with our folks there, show up to the Capitol if we're having a day on the Capitol, or if you can't show up to the Capitol, write a letter to the editor or record a short video on your phone and just talk about your experience, talk about what you went through. And that's hard. And that's, not something, we don't take that lightly. But I will tell you the most convincing thing that I can do when I sit down with a legislator, a Senate president, a Speaker of the House, anybody, any stakeholder in this process that we're trying to navigate, the most important thing I can do is not give them, my case law examples of why this needs to happen. It's to have them sit down with one of our victim survivors and hear from them and hear, how this affected their life, how this loss affected their life, how they were thrust into a system and didn't understand what was going on. Whatever your story is, I think that if you can feel empowered to tell that story and connect with Marsys Law or MADD or any of the other victims' rights organizations in your area, you should absolutely do that. It's empowering to yourself, but it also, is a huge way to make a change in your local community. And so I would advocate for that. I think that's really helpful. And I would like to thank MADD. Every time we reach out, you connect us with someone in your local state. If we go into a new state where we're getting active, and you guys do great work and have for a very long time. As I mentioned earlier, we do stand on the shoulders of giants in the victims' rights space, and MADD is one of those organizations. So we really do appreciate it.
Well, we greatly appreciate everything Marsys Law, you all are doing to promote victim rights, and we will continue to work with you all until there's a future of no more victims of all violent crimes, including impaired driving. We look forward to continue to working with you, and thank you again for sharing time and sharing what your organization does today.
Absolutely, happy to do it. Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Okay.
Let me try to